We are taking a look at expanding the capabilities of our mobile devices through ports and accessories. Find out more next.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
You are watching IT Pro TV's A Plus show, and we are jumping in and taking a look at how we accessorize our mobile devices. Is it time to bedazzle? No, it's not. We're talking about ports and accessories with these mobile devices. What are we going to be diving into?
Sure, Ronnie. You know, our mobile devices typically have some kind of ports on them that allow us to make connections to either power adapters or peripheral accessories. And that's what we're going to look at in this episode, because it's going to be important to be able to identify the ports that you have available and then some of the cables that we use in order to make the connections to those ports.
All right, sounds like we need to take a closer look at them, so let's go over to the bench.
All right, everyone, come on over here and join me. We've got some stuff laid out here. You're going to see we've got a lot of variety of cables that are actually set up on our bench ahead of time. And what I'm going to do to kind of demonstrate this is I'm going to use one of these little hub adapters that we have. And these are great because, let's face it, sometimes you'll get a laptop that has maybe a USB or maybe two USB-C ports, but it doesn't allow you to connect to maybe an external monitor if you don't have those available ports, right? So what I'd like to do is, let's take a look at this little device here. This is a little hub that we have, and it allows us to expand the functionality by adding additional ports to our mobile devices. You'll see that this is a USB-C connector, and I plug that in. And when I plug that in, it gives me the ability to do HDMI. Believe it or not, I bought this one because I thought this was kind of interesting that they still have VGA around. Let's face it, as technology progresses, we don't see a lot of VGA connections much anymore, right? Your video graphics array. However, you do have some of those business class machines that still have VGA connections, so you might need to make that. That's more of a legacy thing today. However, if we turn this around, you're going to see some other ports that you should be familiar with and be able to identify. These are your USB ports, and you can see how they're blue, right? These are USB 3.0 ports, right? Now, let's go ahead and let's talk a little bit more about USB, you know, because it's gone through some revisions over the years, right? When we talk about universal serial bus, right, this is a serial connection that allows us a potential to connect up to like 126 devices, right? Over 120 devices. Now, we typically won't do that because it'll cause a lot of congestion within the computer circuitry, but you could potentially do that. Now, I want to show you a couple of different types of ports. I mentioned the C port, right? It is not uncommon to find USB-C on a lot of your mobile devices today, especially more in the Android world today, because it's kind of becoming the port of choice because it's so versatile in what it can do. It can send Ethernet, it can send video, we can send all kinds of things down this connection. And this is your traditional Type A connector. And you might ask me, you might be saying, well, Wes, why the Type A connector? Well, sometimes I need to plug my phone, if you will, into a laptop for whatever reason, maybe to transfer files, if you will, and I can do a tether by the USB-A device plugged into the laptop and the USB-C device plugged into the mobile device itself. So USB-C is one that's becoming more of the common standard over one that we've had around for quite a while, right? And this one here, this one's going to be the micro USB connector, right? And that micro USB connector is still on devices today, right? So what does the micro USB connector do for us? Well, a lot of times what we're using it for is charging, right? But remember that it is a possible connector that you can see in things like your smartphones and your tablets. Now, one that I want to mention, we mention it in mobile devices, but it's becoming kind of a thing of the past. This is actually your mini USB connector. And if I show this next to the micro USB connector, you can see the difference in the form factor there, right? This one is not so much used for mobile anymore. It's still used, you still find it. But again, for mobile devices, it's just one that we want to keep in there so you are familiar with the variety of connections. One of the last USB connectors I want to kind of mention, and you're going to see where this comes up, is the Type B connector. Now that's interesting. The Type B connector we commonly know as a USB printer port, right? A printer connector. But I don't want you to just associate it with a printer connector. I want you to know that it has a lot more utilization than just a printer port. We're going to see that coming up here soon.
Now, when you start talking about especially USB, no matter what it is, we tend to see a ton of different accessories with them, like webcams.
That's right.
And trackpads, whatever it might be. So we actually have to make sure that we understand those, because those particular charges or those particular ports, they're going to require the right cable.
They are, and Ronnie, I'm glad you mentioned that. So we've actually got a webcam here, and it's a little bit of older Logitech cam, but if you notice right here, it's using the Type A connector, right? So let's say, for instance, maybe I had a laptop that the camera's not working, or maybe you had to have, for some reason, a company-issued webcam. Well, this would allow you that connection. So USB is very, very common for those accessories that Ronnie is talking about too. Now, these are common standardized connections. Keep in mind that we also have things like, for instance, Apple devices, and Apple traditionally uses a lot of proprietary connections, even going back to their earlier 15-pin power connector, which is pretty much legacy today, in favor of another connection. And that connection is what's known as the Lightning connector, right? The Lightning connector is the proprietary Apple connector, if you will, and this is used for a charging cable as well as being able to transfer data. So if I wanted to synchronize over a non-wireless, a wired connection, you could also connect these into your laptop, if you will, too.
Yeah, we tend to see that on something like an iPhone when you might charge that, or maybe even an older iPad today. The neat thing is, or I guess not neat so much as confusing, right, is that also with Apple, we also see a lot of USB-C on the regular USB-C on devices like their iPad too. So, but it's not technically USB-C, is it? It's actually like Thunderbolt 3 or something like that, right?
The connector still is USB-C. I like how you said that, but yeah, and that goes back to the point about USB-C being so versatile. The fact that you can send multiple technologies over that connector is absolutely amazing. And you're right, Ronnie. It's a good point that, for instance, MacBooks. Sometimes you'll see a MacBook that's got two USB-C ports, and that's all you have. Right? And that might be problematic. It might not be problematic. But if it is, here at the end of the show, we're going to show you something we can get around some of those limitations if your laptop or your mobile device doesn't have the amount of connectors that you need. Moving on, one of the next things I want to talk about is a little bit about the audio connections that we could potentially have. And I'm going to go back to our little hub so you can actually see this, right? This is our little audio jack, right? You can see it called a tip ring sleeve 1/8 inch audio jack, right? You've also seen these essentially on the back of your computers as well in the I/O panels, right? And I plug that in, and then that would go to, like Ronnie mentioned, a headset, if you will, maybe some kind of board if you were connecting the mobile device to some kind of board. But this would give you the ability to add that audio capability if you didn't have it. Now you might ask yourself, well, wait a second, Wes, why would I want to add that audio capability? Well, if you have a 1/8 inch TRS device, but you have a USB-C port, how do you use those devices? Well, you got two options, right? The option is buy one that has the right port, or you might see a converter, right? And the converter would be a USB-C to a 1/8 inch, 1/8 inch jack that you could plug into the bottom of like a cell phone, and you can use those headsets.
Yeah, not only do we actually see it there, but even in cars like as old as mine, they have an auxiliary port, which is that 1/8 inch jack. And when I actually bought the car, somebody had actually left the Lightning connector to the 1/8 inch jack adapter that they had, so that they could actually let their iPhone become essentially play through the actual stereo system.
And Ronnie, that makes a good point. Like with these adapters that we're talking about, it gives you the compatibility if you don't have the compatibility natively in the device. And if you remember one of the things that Ronnie was saying, joking around, we're accessorizing, right? We're expanding the functionality of a device that otherwise might be a little limited in what the connections, have. Now, I use this right here is a common little, if you will, cheap 1/8 inch cable, right? You can see how, I mean, it's really brittle. This one is a little bit better, right? You can see the connectors here, a lot better, a lot thicker cable, right? Probably got some shielding in the cable, so probably gives you a better audio quality. So these are some of the ports that I would be aware of. Now, that's not the only port, and in the when we talk about some of the connections that you could make, one of the ones that's mentioned that's kind of gone by the wayside, if you will, especially in little mobile devices, maybe still in laptops, and I know in laptops because you have to make connections to things like connectivity devices, and you have to make some configurations. Now, you might be looking, and here's a little thing to keep in mind, right? Notice that little jack right there. That's a VGA jack. But it is called a D connector, right? This is the D25 or the D15 connector, and this is the D9 connector. Notice the difference, right? The top one here is what we call a console cable. All right, and they do mention that console cable and mobile ports, and what this would allow you to do is take the RJ45 jack that's on the outside, the other side of this, plug it into your laptop, and then what you could do is if you had a connectivity device or a firewall such as this, you could make that serial-based console connection to it, and you could send those commands into it to configure it. Again, not something that's so popular on a smaller mobile device, if you will, but on a laptop, definitely something that you would probably use in the field if you were maybe in the server closet and you need physical access and needed to connect to the console port on the connectivity device. Those are your serial interfaces, as they are called. The technical term for the serial interface, you might hear them called logically in software as COM ports. Remember, hardware-wise, you might hear the RS-232 null modem cable. They're basically serial interfaces, and what we're using them for today is to configure our connectivity devices. So those are, now let's talk about some other ports, right? One of the things that I mentioned is that you might have a mobile device that you want to send a communication or an output to an external display. Well, you do have the ability, if you have, for instance, maybe built into the laptop, or if you have a mobile device that doesn't have it, you might be able to use something like this, and that's that HDMI port you can see right there. The HDMI port would connect to the HDMI cable. We would plug that USB, in this case, the USB-C, into the side of the laptop, and then we could run the other connection out to the external monitor. Now, that's not the only one, ladies and gentlemen, that we have, too. You also have DisplayPort, right? This is a full-size DisplayPort. I would be able to identify what the connector looks like and some of the characteristics of the cable. This is a mini DisplayPort, and that's not uncommon to see adapter-type cables that have two different form factors on them, just like we've seen in the console cable. It had a DB9 connector on one side and had an RJ45 on the other. That's not uncommon as well. So those are some of your video cables that you might have to use. One of the final ones that I put in here, and I put in here for complete, to just be all over complete with some of the connections that you might see when it comes to your mobile devices. Last but not least is this one right here. This is a little Thunderbolt cable. Now, I want you to understand that sometimes it's hard to tell which one's which, because this one here is a mini DisplayPort. This one here is a Thunderbolt cable. So what's the difference? Well, as far as the form factor goes, nothing. They're identical. It's the signal that's being sent across them that is a little bit different. Now, if you remember, one of the things that I said is that I mentioned, for instance, the USB Type B connector, right? We have other ways that we can expand the functionality of these mobile devices. If your mobile device is not so mobile, and what I mean is maybe you have a laptop that you bring into an office and you sit that laptop down and you need some expanded functionality. Well, in the earlier days, you would get these huge things known as docking stations, right? And a docking station will allow you to add additional hard drives, would allow you to add different external display devices, and they also differentiated from what were known as port replicators. Today, that line is blurred, right? And the reason I say is because port replicators used to be no bigger than something like this. But with the scale of technology getting smaller and smaller, these are actually docking stations today over the earlier days when they were much larger. Let me show you what I mean. So we've got a few different docking stations here, and you can see there's a variety of ports, right? You can see we have right here that USB Type B connector. This one's one I didn't mention because it's kind of legacy now, but if we're going to mention, let's turn it right side up so you can actually see it and read it. That's your DVI connector. You can see your HDMI connector, RJ45 jack, and then your USB ports here too. Well, that USB Type B connector would run to the A connector into your laptop, and then you would run to an external monitor, and this would give you the ability to expand the functionality of your mobile device. We also have a couple of different types here as well. If you look, this is another one, and notice the Thunderbolt connections. Notice they look just like DisplayPort, but they got the little lightning bolt, right? And then we also have HDMI, and then of course the power adapter. We've got our USB and RJ45 jacks, right? These are examples of docking stations. The docking station today is a good way that if you are going to take a mobile device, and maybe you're going to sit within a cubicle, if you will, and you need to expand the functionality, you can add additional ports and, by association, those accessories to your mobile devices, thereby expanding its functionality and the user experience. These are some of the things when it comes to the ports and the accessories I would be able to identify so you can support this technology.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.